Fairest of All, A Tale of the Wicked Queen by Serena Valentino. Copyright 2009, Disney Enterprises Incorporated, published by Disney Press. Chapter 9, The Maker of Mirrors. Hearing the crash, the king rushed to the queen's chamber. He found the queen awake but shaken, lying on the cold stone floor. The queen was trembling, clutching the curtain she had torn from the mirror. She looked up, but the man in the mirror was no longer there. The king reached out to her, but she recoiled in horror. "What is it, woman? Speak to me." "I'm so sorry, my love. I didn't mean to frighten you," the queen said groggily, attempting to catch her breath. I must have fainted." The queen was dizzy. She couldn't find her own voice to further explain what had just happened. All she could manage was, "The mirror." The king looked to the mantel. "Your father's mirror, of course. This is why you've had such an aversion to it. Had I known everything you just told me, I never would have brought it into our home." The queen struggled to speak again. "Break it, please," she managed to mutter. Without hesitation, the king tore the mirror from the wall and smashed it into the mantel. Shattered glass littered the chamber floor like stardust sprinkled over a moonless sky. The queen sighed, relieved, though not entirely convinced that the mirror was destroyed for good. She gathered all her strength to speak. "Before the day I met you, my lord, I dreaded visiting my father in his workshop. Seeing my face reflected back at me again and again only reminded me of how unsightly I was, a fact of which I didn't need reminding. A day of my childhood didn't pass when my father didn't tell me how unattractive I was, how ugly, and that is how I saw myself. My mother was beautiful. I knew that from the portrait that hung in my father's dingy little house. The one source of beauty in my life was that portrait, and I would stare at it for hours, wondering why I wasn't beautiful like her. I didn't understand why my father was content to live in a run-down hovel of a house, when he could afford a life anywhere he desired. No matter how much I scrubbed, I couldn't rid the house of its stale, musty scent. I couldn't imagine my mother, so beautiful, living in that house, and I fancied that somehow the house, too, must have been mourning my mother's death. I fancied that while she was alive, it was probably a pleasant little cottage where birds would alight to feed on the windowsill, and flowers bloomed all around. But after her death, everything within the house was moldering and distressed, all except for my mother's things, which my father kept locked away. Sometimes I would go through her trunks and adorn myself with her old dresses and jewelry, lovely dresses with intricate beadwork and jewels that sparkled like the stars. She seemed to love beautiful, delicate things, and I wondered, if she had lived, would she have loved me, too, ugly as I was? The stories of my father's love for my mother were known throughout the lands. The tales of the maker of mirrors and his beautiful wife were told throughout every kingdom, like an ancient myth, woven with strands of love and sorrow. My father made beautiful mirrors of all shapes and sizes, lovely mirrors that inspired the great kings and queens to travel over hill and dale just to purchase one of his gorgeous and enchanting treasures. My mother loved the winter solstice, and my father would make the grandest spectacle of the occasion. He made tiny mirrors in the shapes of suns, moons, and stars, and hung them all in the trees on their grounds. Candles, too, decorated the trees, casting the most magnificent light reflected in the mirrors, so that their home could be seen for miles around. A tiny magical city, illuminated and glowing in a sea of wintry darkness. He was heard to remark upon the gorgeous glow he created around his home every winter, saying it was pale in comparison to the beauty of his wife. Her raven hair, her fair skin, the sparkling onyx eyes, the sort that tilt up at the corners, adding a cat-like quality to them. How I wish someone would love me the way my father loved his wife. So inspired by her beauty, he created intricate treasures so she could see her grace reflected back at her. I thought I would never know that love, or know what it was to be beautiful. And then I met you in my father's mirror shop, when you ventured off promising to return, leaving me alone and bewildered. My father's reaction sent my heart racing into panic. "Clearly you've bewitched him, daughter. Soon enough he will see you for the vile hag you are, he told me. I attempted to convince him I was no witch. I knew no enchantments, but he persisted. Do you think a man such as he would have you as a wife? You are too old, daughter, and unsightly. You are unremarkable in every way. My mother's death was a result of my birth, and I am sure my father blamed me for it, seeing my resemblance to her as a taunting insult added to the injury of his loss. My father never talked about the night my mother died, but I heard tiny shards of the story and pieced them together in my imagination, like reflection in one of his broken mirrors. I imagined my mother writhing in terrible agony. In my mind, I saw her clutching her bulging stomach in pain, crying out to her husband for help as the midwife tended to her. My father helpless, his face white and ghastly, filled with fear as my mother lay there lifeless after giving birth, and his eyes filled with revulsion when he looked upon the little creature that had ripped his dearest love from his life. My father must have hated me from that day. Whenever he looked upon my face, it was with disgust. Once, I must have been 5 or 6 years of age. I was standing in our yard. The sun streamed through the canopy of trees. I was holding a bunch of wildflowers when my father came upon me. "What are you doing with those flowers, girl?" he asked. His face was screwed up in controlled anger. I told him that I wanted to bring the flowers to my mother. He stared at me blankly and cruelly. "You didn't even know her. Why would she want flowers from you?" I remember being too sad, too shocked, to cry as I responded. She was my mama, and I love her. He just looked at me in that way I had become accustomed to. That way that told me if I said anything more he would strike me. Sometimes he would strike me even if I remained silent. That day, I just stood there and held out the flowers, looking up at him with my lip quivering, my eyes on the verge of tears, but too overcome with so many different emotions to express them by crying outright. He tore the flowers from my tiny hand. Then he turned his back on me and walked out of the courtyard. I hoped that he would place the flowers on my mother's grave, but I am all but certain he never did. I promised myself I would never let my father's demon taint my soul. I swore that I was starting a new life with you. I wanted to forget him and be happy with you and my beautiful little bird. I vowed I would make Snow my own daughter and love her the way I wished my father had loved me, that I would tell Snow White how beautiful she was every day of her life, and we would dance together and laugh. And unlike my father, I would take Snow to visit her mother's grave and use the letters you entrusted me with to tell her what her mother was like. I resolved to never think of the maker of mirrors ever again. He belongs to the darkness now. The day my father died, it was as if my life was set ablaze, as if his descent into darkness brought me into a shining world where I was finally able to find love and happiness. That very hour, I brought every one of his mirrors outside our home and hung them from a giant tree on the grounds. It was the most remarkable spectacle I'd ever seen. The mirrors swaying in the breeze, catching the sunlight and reflecting it in the most magnificent way. The sight of it took my breath away. The townsfolk thought it was beautiful too. They believed it was a tribute to my father, and I let them believe that. They needn't know what a horrible man he was. They needn't know I was for the first time coming out into the light, that I was no longer lingering in darkness and doubt. That was the true reason I celebrated. No one knew how much he hated me, how cruel and utterly inhumane his soul was. A soul? Huh! I wonder if he ever had one. He must have at some point. His love for my mother was so great. Perhaps his soul died with her the night she left this world. Still, whatever was left of him was pure evil. I had sat by his deathbed caring for him, trying to keep him alive, because in my heart of hearts I knew that it was right to treat the blood of your blood that way. Still, he had nothing but hatred and bitter words for me. "He'll never come for you, you know. You've always been an ugly child. What would a king want with the likes of you?" I was there as he left this world, right by his side, holding on to his hand so that he would not need to journey into that great unknown alone. In the moment before he died, his near lifeless eyes looked up at me. I was full of folly, ready to believe that he was going to thank me, Instead, he said, "I've never loved you, daughter." And then he closed his eyes and left this world. The king sat silently. He rested his chin on his folded hands as he rocked back and forth, contemplating all he had just learned. Then he knelt down next to the queen and took her into his arms. "I wish he were alive today," the king said, "so I could slay him with my own hands for all he has done." The queen looked up at her husband, who she had known only to be filled with love, to love even his enemies. Did he truly care for her so much that he would even betray his own beliefs? This was the man she loved above all others. She touched his hand, callous with battle scars and the weight of artillery and wielding of swords. She locked her hands in his and crawled into his arms, then kissed him lightly on the lips. His once soft mouth was now chapped and chafed from exposure to the elements. He tasted like sweat, and the queen thought, blood. Why, she wondered, must things change? Why could she not have frozen time the day she was married, lived happily ever after with Snow and the king? Why could she not create peace on earth so that her husband would not even need to leave her again? She wondered this very thing for the next month, while she still had the king with her. But on the 23rd day of January, the king left again. "Papa, I'm going to miss you," said Snow. "I promise to come home to you soon, my Snow. I always do, don't I?" The little girl nodded. "I love you, and I will miss you, dear," the king said with a deep sigh. "I love you too, Papa." The king kissed his daughter and spun her around, which made her giggle. "I'll miss you both with all my heart. You'll both be with me." The queen and Snow stood in the courtyard and watched as the king and his men ventured over snow-covered mountains on horseback. Their torches glowed in the dark winter afternoon, and the air was the kind of cold that glassed your eyes over, a type of cold you can practically see. The king's army grew smaller and smaller, like ants climbing piles of sugar. Then they dipped down the horizon, and the king was gone. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, like and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that notification bell to keep up to date on all the new magic. Have a magical day.